Yeah, thank you very much indeed to give me the chance and the opportunity just to start with some short remarks. Don't worry. I'm glad that we have this session since, I mean, in every country, since infectious disease are, which is good, on decline because of better treatment and vaccination we have. Non-communicable diseases are the ones actually that get more and more into the focus of the WHO as well as within the international community, and of course for the national health politics. In an aging society as Germany is, we know already that in 2030 we will have 600,000, that is what we assume, 600,000 new diagnoses of cancer per year. And that counts for all societies, since all our societies are aging societies, meanwhile on different levels, but nevertheless. By the way, I just learned that China soon will be the country and remain the country with most new cancer diagnoses per year on the world, and that might change research. Because of the genetical background of the disease, if the focus changes, we might get to know a different view, even in Europe and the Western world, on research and what this development means for us and our treatment and situation. We have a good situation in Germany with the German Cancer Research Center in Heidelberg. Perhaps some of you know it. It's engaged very much worldwide in the research. We have a good network. We try to improve it from a bench to bedside and back, but still we have the feeling we can get better. And like the US started a kind of moonshot initiative around cancer, we are just about to pronounce next week the National Decade Against Cancer. The Federal Ministry of Research, my colleague and I, as the Minister for Health, we will pronounce it next week. And the idea is actually to bring more together the research community and the clinicians. That what I said, to bedside and back, that better works. We want to focus on biotech, of course, digitization, artificial intelligence in this area of cancer. We want that the perspective of patients and families is more, and their families is more in the focus of what we do. Psycho-oncology treatment, for example, is something so far a bit undervalued when it comes to treatment. And that is actually what we are about to start next week. Of course, I just had some talks yesterday and today with pharmaceutical companies. We need to take into account what's going on research-wise. I'm very glad and very interesting what we hear on the panel right now. CAR-T, for example, is for every national health system a kind of challenge because it's quite expensive. I mean, it really seems to bring, let me put it that way, new big chances for patients that had no chance for treatment right now after everything was tried, and that it's a new chance. Just last week, I visited a children oncology capacity in Berlin with the Charité, our big university hospital, and they tried it or they needed to try because they had no other chance for a 1-year-old child with leukemia for the first time with the blood of the mother and not of the child, and it was healed. Seems to be gone, the disease, and that is really progress. But it's coming with big costs too. And so it's a challenge for us in the national health system, actually. How do we deal with all these new treatments that are on the way? So actually that is what we plan on the national level. What I'd love to close up with that one, to have is that we have a real European initiative on this one. Some are flying to the moon right now and show the world what they are capable to do. And I think we as Europe at least, and perhaps we can combine it with other countries and regions then, in Europe we should focus more on some concrete goals that explain to people why it makes sense to work together. I mean, a multilateral world only works if people back home realize its added value for all of us. And fighting cancer and making really progress in it and saying we want to combat cancer in the next 10 years could be such a goal for Europe, and to combine forces and to make really a difference in the upcoming 10 years. So from the national decade against cancer, I'd love to actually widen it up to a European decade against cancer in the upcoming, well, after the upcoming European election, and then perhaps even combine forces with other regions of the world. So for this, it is important to talk to each other worldwide, and this is a perfect panel for that. And so I'm very keen on to hear what's actually going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Spahn. And that was a great segue to where we're headed. So on this, the last day of the 2019 World Economic Forum annual meeting, we've saved the best for last. We have an extraordinary panel. But before we introduce them, I just want to lay some two facts out for you. So late last year, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded its prize for physiology or medicine to Kazuko Honjo and Jim Allison for their seminal discoveries that have led to what is now a modern revolution in the immunotherapy against cancer. If you look in just the last year, there have been more than 6 approvals of drugs, of agents that unleash the power of the immune system on cancer in Europe and in the United States. And there are many people now in the research community who are genuinely excited about next level breakthroughs in this fight against cancer. So that's the good news. The not so good news is that about the same time as these announcements were being made about the Nobel Prize, the World Health Organization's IARC, its agency that studies cancer, was releasing, to much less fanfare, something that was kind of frightening, which was its published estimates for the cancer burden in the world. And so the numbers were 18.1 million new cases of cancer across the world in 2018 and 9.6 million deaths. So I just want to repeat that for a minute. 18.1 million new cases of cancer in 2018, last year, and 9.6 million deaths. That's an enormous burden. And this is something that is, as the minister said, is increasingly affecting the developing world, which has really, as it's been fighting infectious disease, and I saw Seth Berkley walk in here, who's doing an extraordinary job, by the way, through the Gavi Alliance of handling these kinds of emerging threats to health. But we do have this long-term burden of cancer that is coming down the pike. And so the good and the bad, as the extraordinary progress we've been making, which is a reason for genuine, I think, celebration, and also the global burden that's rising, which is reason for genuine, sober reflection. And to discuss this epic challenge and how we meet that, we have an extraordinary group, as I said. On my far left is Hiroshi Mikitani, who is the chairman and CEO of Rakuten in Japan. Then in the middle, we have Julie Louise Gerberding, who's Executive Vice President and Chief Patient Officer and Strategic Communications, Global Public Policy, and Population Health for MSD, which is a division of Merck, and is the former head of the CDC in the US. And to my immediate left is Siddhartha Mukherjee, who is the Assistant Professor of Medicine at Columbia University in the US, and of course the author of The Emperor of All Maladies, which is no doubt the most extraordinary book that's ever been written about cancer. And so, I'd love to start with you, Sid, since you've got such a great perspective on the history and timeline of cancer. I mean, The Emperor of All Maladies, I have to say, if you haven't read it, it's extraordinary, it's vivid, it's lyrical, but it really is its own genre of book. You created what I'm now coining a pathography, a biography of a pathology. And you have this fantastic span of history of the disease and the people who have struggled to overcome it. Where are we now in the timeline in the fight against cancer?
Thank you for that introduction. You know, I like to think about the timeline of cancer in a kind of typography. And that typography is very important as we think about the global burden of cancer. And it can be likened to a pyramid. Mm-hmm. The bottom of the pyramid, we know very clearly, is cancer prevention. We are not going to solve the problem of cancer without concentrating on the bottom of the pyramid, which is to prevent cancer from occurring in the first place. And I will talk a lot more about it because we know much more about that bottom of the pyramid than we knew before. The middle of the pyramid would be a broad category, but we might call it secondary prevention or early detection, finding cancer in its early phases and removing it so that it does not spread and metastasize in the body, because of course, for most cancers, it's metastatic cancer that kills you, not the primary tumor generally. Mm-hmm. The top of the pyramid is cancer treatment. So again, prevention, early detection, treatment, vast amounts of resources and a vast amount of national attention and international attention is paid at the top of the pyramid, and there's good reason for that, for treatment. And of course, immunotherapy is one example of that, is the capacity to treat cancer using the immune system. But it's important to remember that it's the bottom of the pyramid that deserves attention in the next decade or so. And it's important to remember that all these three parts communicate with each other. These are not isolated silos. So let me talk a little bit about prevention, and we can come and talk more globally about treatment in a second. What do we know now about cancer prevention as the landscape has evolved? Well, number one, the one surprising thing and one disturbing thing about what we know about the bottom of the pyramid is that for the last decade or so, and this is going to be a provocative, controversial statement, so push back on it.
That's what we want, yeah.
For the last decade or so, I would argue, we have not found removable human chemical carcinogens of substantial impact. Our capacity to find removable human chemical carcinogens of substantial numerical impact has gone down dramatically. That does not mean that they don't exist. Of course, tobacco smoke is rampant. It's a huge carcinogen, but we've known that since the 1980s, 1950s, 1960s, you might say. Big carcinogens that really we haven't been able to find. When people ask me, what do I do in my own life as an oncologist to avoid cancer, I'm not doing anything different in 2017 that I wasn't doing in 1997, fundamentally speaking. So there are three possible reasons for this. Reason one is that we aren't finding them because we don't have the right tools. Reason two is that they do exist, but they're death by 1,000 cuts. So there are many of them. They have impact. They're somehow additive. They're adding themselves up in the body. And reason three is that maybe they don't exist in the way that we think they exist. In fact, some or a fraction of cancer is the result of changes in DNA that are acquired when cells divide and make mistakes. Now, that is not to say that there aren't carcinogens that we should not be tackling. That's a double negative. In other words, that is to say that there are carcinogens that we should be tackling. Human papillomavirus, tobacco smoke, and other viruses that are rampant across the world which we can vaccinate against, other forms of carcinogens. But the point is that we need to learn much, much more about the bottom of the pyramid, and that we are learning a lot more about the bottom of the pyramid. So I'd like to concentrate, as we move along in the panel, at what we know now about the bottom of that pyramid.
So I definitely want to do that, but Julia, if you'll forgive me, Sid, I want to go to the top of the pyramid for just a second. And that's because, so you work for MSD, which is part of Merck. Merck has been a pioneering leader in the case of immunotherapy for cancer. But you've also been, in a previous life, the head of the Center for Disease Prevention and for CDC, Control and Prevention. And a huge part of that is the bottom of the pyramid. So you've had some experience on both. My question is, do you think that the progress we're making at the top of the pyramid is substantial enough to make a difference, given what you know about the ongoing challenge of the burden?
And first of all, thank you for including me on the panel, and thanks to everyone who's here to listen and learn. You know, you really said yourself at the beginning, if we have 18 million new cases of cancer a year, we are not succeeding at the bottom of that pyramid. So Clearly, we have a lot of work to do in that area. And, you know, there are drivers for those numbers. And one of the biggest drivers, of course, is the aging of our population, because as you said, the accumulation of our duration on Earth also accumulates changes in our DNA that probably predispose us to cancer. But we're also living in an environment where there are enormous disparities in the incidence of cancer, not just geographic disparities, but socioeconomic disparities and exposure disparities in some cases. But I think the third thing that we're learning is that we really can bend the curve. So we have pockets where we're seeing relative success in cancer prevention and control, and I'll just mention a couple. Tobacco, in countries that really have implemented comprehensive tobacco control programs, the curve is bending on lung cancer. And that is a tremendous public health success. Granted, it took decades to get there, and we still have a long way to go, but you know, we can change the shape of that pyramid. I think the other that you mentioned in terms of HPV as a carcinogen, we're seeing now that a combination of vaccination and screening for HPV disease and hopefully early and better treatments really can essentially eliminate cervical cancer. At least it's technically possible to have that conversation. Again, massive disparities, and we have a long way to go to get there. And the last thing I would say is just in terms of the science of the situation, probably the biggest curve bender ahead of us really relates to the breakthroughs in the science that we now have at our disposal, the tools in our toolbox. You mentioned the CAR-T therapy or the gene therapy for a child with leukemia, Minister, but there are so many new modalities now that we really, this is the time to have the decade against cancer, because we do have the tools in our toolbox.
So Julie, let me follow up on some of these bending curves. So in the case of cervical cancer, we have made tremendous strides in the developed world, but in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still a major killer of women. And what was frightening is the latest report from the World Health Organization showed that lung cancer rates globally were rising in women, in large part because of a lack of tobacco control programs in much of the world. You know, this is a challenge of, when we talk about cancer, we're talking about hundreds of diseases, and we're also talking about huge disparities in terms of the kinds of people who get it and where they are and how they're being treated. Even in the developed world, we see dramatically different rates in survival between Black Americans, for example, and white Americans. And so how do we begin to address these disparities with the structure that we have?
Well, one way of thinking about it is to remember that the pyramid that we're talking about does demonstrate that the biggest value comes from addressing the base. And prevention on a per capita basis is much cheaper than any treatment that we have at the tip of the pyramid. So we do need to think differently about how we prioritize our investments. And the prevention investments are always, if not cost savings, cost effective.
So if you prevent cancer, you're reducing both ends of the cancer burden, the new cases and the deaths, as opposed to just the mortality. Mickey, this is, you know, we talk sometimes in these big statistics. You have a statistic of 1, which is why you got into this. Talk a little bit about the experience with your father being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer.
Yeah. So to self myself a little bit, I'm an internet entrepreneur. I started my own company, Rakuten, 22 years ago. And you know, when nobody really believe anybody will buy something on the internet. So I'm kind of disruptive, crazy entrepreneur, but kind of survived for the last 22 years. If you look back on, probably Amazon and ourselves are only 2 companies survived this long. And then we, family, found out my father had a pancreatic cancer 6 years ago. At that time, I didn't have much knowledge about the cancer, to be very honest, but I loved my father, and I'm kind of crazy enough to start my journey, exploration, to find the most advanced cure against pancreatic cancer. So literally I travel all around the world, I went to Stanford, UCSF, UC San Diego, I went to Columbia, Harvard, Paris University, many universities in Japan. And the conclusion was, other than very, very toxic combination therapy, there was no good cure. But interesting enough, my friend, who is a client of my business, called me, and he was also a friend of my father. Told me, hey, Miki, my cousin is doing this very interesting research at NCI. He's Japanese. And what is it? And he said, he's using lights to cure the cancer.
Using light to cure cancer, yeah.
I said, give me a break, right? How can you cure the cancer with light? But I was desperate. So, and he said, by the way, President Obama mentioned about this project in his inauguration speech. I said, oh, I better go and check it out. So I made a meeting with them, and it was kind of my chin dropped and eye-opening opportunity for me. What it is, basically, we create a conjugate of antibody with some special chemical, and which certainly react only to certain type of lights.
Yeah.
And they were just trying on the animals at the time. I saw it. And when I spoke with my doctor friends about this, 99% of them said, hey, Miki, those kind of things work on animal, but it never worked on human. Mm-hmm. But I was amateur enough. No, this is going to work. It really doesn't, because we're not talking about chemical reaction or biological action. We're talking about triggering the chemical reaction using lights, being targeting and specifically destroying the cancers. I didn't know about the side effect or what would be the ongoing immune response at the time, but I thought this should work. And that's, I think, strength of the amateurs. Right? Everybody in this industry for a long, long time, are kind of trapped or, in my opinion, paranoid.
Right.
But I have a fresh eye, and now we're in we completed phase 2 trial, and the result has been very, very amazing.
So that's exciting. Sid, as somebody who, again, coming back to your role as historian and doctor, we've had these moments of optimism where now we're talking about immunotherapy. But back in the 1900s, we were talking about radiation therapy as the great cure, and then combination chemotherapy, which in the early cases of the cures of leukemia and Hodgkin's disease, which I'm actually standing here as a beneficiary of that early cancer chemotherapy in the 1970s. And then we had anti-angiogenesis drugs. These were drugs that were going to choke off the blood supply. And then we had the molecularly targeted medicines like Gleevec, which were the smart drugs in cancer. And in fact, even before this, we had immunotherapies, super drugs like interleukin-2 and interferon, which we put on the cover of Fortune in 1985. We've been through this before. How real is, or what's different about the immunotherapy revolution that we're in now?
Well, first of all, you have to think of our armamentarium against cancer not as individual therapies, but as the possibility of combine. These are things that are additive. So, in other words, cytotoxic chemotherapy, the kind of therapy that we use, is great at reducing tumor burden. It kills cells and brings down your cell burden from billions of cells down to hundreds of cells, thousands of cells. But of course, it often doesn't cure. It cures some cancers, but doesn't cure many cancers. And those 10,000 cells that are left, 100,000, 1 million cells, then grow up again, and it's like beheading the monster and comes right back. Targeted therapies allowed us to use Achilles heels-like concepts to now go after even those 1,000, 10,000, 1 million cells that were left and attack them with their particular vulnerabilities. Immunotherapy is yet another iteration in this, but here's what's different, and it's very important. is that most of the cancer therapies that we were developing thus far were seed therapies. And this is an old concept that goes back to the 1800s. And it is to imagine cancer as the seed and the body as the soil, or the host as the soil. The seed, of course, this concept comes from the great surgeon Paget, who made a very simple, asked a very simple question. I mean, if you read Paget's, I make my students actually go back and read Paget's
1898.
paper. So it's an incredibly important paper in which Paget just asks a simple question. He says, the spleen is about the same size as the liver. It has a similar kind of blood supply. And yet the liver is a vastly disproportional site of metastases. The spleen barely ever gets the metastases. He gives a second example. He says, breast cancer metastasizes to the bone, but who's ever heard of a finger metastasis of breast cancer? You've never heard it metastasized to the axial skeleton, but not to the distal skeleton. It's the same bone. So why is immunotherapy different? Immunotherapy is different because it uses the soil to attack the seed. And why is that important? That is important because now we're beginning to understand that cancer is an interaction between seed and soil, and that we know have to understand much, much more about the soil. I'm going to give you two studies that were published recently that are very important. One is a study in which they biopsied the esophageal cells from patients elderly patients with and without smoking, smokers and non-smokers. What's important is the following point, which is that even within the non-smokers, but especially within the smokers, you can see cancerous changes in cells, but no frank cancer. In fact, if you look at the esophagus of such a person, there are what would be technically called cancer cells, but they're not cancerous, they're not invasive. Something about their body, something about the physiological state of the body, whether it's the immune system, whether it is a metabolic milieu, something is controlling or putting a back pressure on the development of cancer. So what I think is important about immunotherapy is actually two things, one of which has been widely appreciated. The widely appreciated thing is that it's a great treatment for cancer. It allows us to understand how to use the immune system against cancers that were previously very refractory to treatment. But the second thing that has been less appreciated is that it begins to open up the box of the soil. And when you open up the box of the soil, you actually find a kind of wormhole, as it were, from the treatment down to prevention. You can ask questions like, why is it that some people are not getting cancer? Is it because there's something special about their immune system? Is it something about their soil that we haven't previously identified? So it breaks, it finally, I hope, we are hoping, all of us, that it will allow us to break through this kind of impasse that we were in cancer prevention by identifying states or identifying people who are at higher risk, and thereby beginning to sort of coordinate this pyramid from the bottom up to the top. It's a soil therapy, and I'm very excited about soil therapies because they are a change in the way we think about the paradigms of cancer.
I think that's very helpful, the seed and soil hypothesis of cancer. Julie, you said something really important before, which is you said as we age, we accumulate mutations in our DNA. Lots of accidents happen. Some of them are assaults from the outside in the chemical world or the physical world. Some of them are internal in terms of radicals, free radicals that happen and go into the body, oxygen, metabolizing chemicals that interact with DNA. And as this happens, you know, this accumulation of DNA mutations, sometimes it happens in just the wrong way and all the fail-safes fail and you start to get cancer. Are we human beings at an inevitable, you know, is this just an inevitability of being human, of getting cancer over time? It's just another, you know, breakdown of the body, as it were.
Well, I think there's some plausibility in your theory, but clearly there's so many exceptions to that rule that I don't think we can say it's an inevitability. But, you know, when you were talking about the seed and the soil, I was thinking when I was very young and starting out my career in biology, I was told by an important professor that if you understood syphilis, you would understand medicine. Then I became an intern, and we had the HIV epidemic, and I was told, well, if we really understand HIV and how it's interacting with the body and how it's evolving and the opportunistic infections and cancers that follow it, we will understand medicine. And now I'm really beginning to think that if we understood cancer, we would really understand medicine, and particularly the psychoneurobiologic axis, which these days even includes the biomes. Because there's so much information exchange going on in our bodies all the time. It's not just a static process of DNA eventually making too many mistakes.
Right.
There are problems, and then there are corrective factors and humors and small molecules that are speaking to our immune systems all the time, and we simply don't.
There are so many of these systems. Yep. There was the genome, which was supposed to give us the code to life, and then there's the proteome, which is the proteins that are encoded by these genes, and then there's the metabolome, which is all of the the metabolic things, and the bacteriome, all the bacteria that are synergistic, and so on. And as we've come, there's just so much data to process.
And I think another dimension of this is, the dogma has always been that as you age, your immune system gradually deteriorates. So that part of the susceptibility here is the accumulation, and the other part is the fact that our defense systems wear down. But one of the interesting things that we see in some of the patients who are responding to immunotherapy is they're really old.
Right.
And so it tells you that when you turn their immune system back on, there's enough immune system there to basically cure their cancer. Right. Now, how could that be? I mean, it defies our traditional dogma about immune senescence.
So Mickey, when I was talking with you earlier before this session, it was clear that you were talking about antibody conjugates and this, EGFR receptors and all of these, the sort of the conversation of modern cancer and biology that you've seemed to have mastered in a short time. I'm guessing that as your self-described crazy technology disruptor, that 6 years ago, before your father's illness, you didn't know any of this stuff. How did you start to teach yourself about the sort of the cancer biology?
Well, of course, when we learned that my father had a pancreatic cancer, I visited and had a talk with the top scientists and oncologists and everybody. And during that course, I learned the basics of cancer cells and immune system and so forth. And then I, of course, invested. I was so angel investor to this photoimmunotherapy project, as a matter of fact. I funded like 95% of it so far. And definitely, I'm in the board meeting. I write notes about the words. Everybody's talking about what are they talking about, right? Right. And go back and Google it and read books. And I'm not saying I'm really completely understand, but our approach is not really super targeting any DNA or RNA, and I think the reason why I could have understand the approach is coming from a totally different angle compared with other therapies.
So I want to jump into that because there are so many tech entrepreneurs now who are getting into cancer, and there is this they're bringing a mentality of, quote, fail fast into the cancer research world and development. And they're really pushing the envelope in some cases into new science, into places that traditional science hasn't gone. Sometimes they're just faster in terms of creating genomic sequencing companies or others, the tools, the technology of the world. What is it about the tech world? What can the tech world bring to the cancer research world?
Well, first of all, including my project, although this is for-profit business, most of the cause is coming from kind of philanthropical mindset. So I put in $300 million. I think this is going to be hugely successful, but even if you fail, we don't care, right? Because this is like we bring the money back to the society. The second, the good thing about this kind of philanthropic approach is bringing in the mentality of entrepreneurship to drug development. And of course, it's totally different field, but entrepreneurs really care about the reality, right? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, in this cancer academic society, there are all sorts of ongoing long talk. Our approach, let's just test and see. Let's just explore. So I think mentality approach are a little bit different. And of course, we cannot do it by ourselves, but we can be a great partner to the great scientists.
So, Julie, the Minister Spahn said earlier about the cost of some of these drugs. You work for a drug company, a big one. Just to put this in perspective, in the last 5 years in the United States, the drug costs, cancer drug costs have doubled in just 5 years. They're predicted to double again. In 2017, the average drug that came out, that was released in the market, was averaged $100,000 as an average cost. In fact, there was no drug in 2018 that was below $100,000 when it was released. If you're thinking about, as Sid said, it's additive, the treatments. We're going to be combining a lot of these drugs. How can even developed Western countries afford this, let alone the developing world? We got to get our hands around this, don't we?
We do. And at the same time, having cancer is very expensive. Mm-hmm. If you need treatment and chemotherapy and radiation therapy and surgery and all of the other modalities that come into play, the cost of cancer care is expensive. So what we really need to find are the ways that we can precisely identify patients who are going to respond to a given set of tools and recognize that the aim here is cure. Mm-hmm. So curing cancer is going to be a lot less expensive than spending a lot of money over an arc of time in treating it enough and repeatedly treating it. And we don't think of cancer medicines as investments in cures. If you just look at the cost of the medicine, yes, it's a large number. But if you look at what's the cost averted when you're able to treat with highly effective cancer medicines, you can see that that innovation is really worth it. And I just kind of go back again to the HIV environment, because when we were beginning to launch HIV drugs, we had the same conversation. Those drugs were expensive when they first came out. Yeah. And of course, over time and as the period of exclusivity ends, the drugs are now widely available in every part of the world at a price that is affordable. But the incredible cost of care of HIV disease in 1980 really justifies the investment that were made in the
What accounts for the rise, though? Because in 2013, and this has been happening for a while. You can go back and see this really kind of extraordinary rise. In 2013, the WHO estimates that global spending on cancer drugs, just on drugs, was $96 billion in 2013. In 2017, just 4 years later, it was $133 billion. And it's projected to go again by that same slope upward. Why is it so, I understand why it's expensive, but why is it getting so much more expensive so fast?
There are a couple of reasons for, I think, the rapid increase. One is that the drugs are working, so we're using them in a lot more patients, particularly the current and hopefully future generations of the immuno-oncology drugs. MSD has one of the immuno-oncology drugs, and we are having 900 clinical trials with this drug in 30 different tumor types, and we already have survival advantage in several. So, we're seeing the investment increase because the drugs are working, and they're working much more broadly than we imagined.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's important to say that the numbers are a little scary in terms of the fact that even now, only about a third of people respond to these immunotherapies in the specific cancers. And melanoma, which is the cancer probably most receptive to immunotherapy, initial response rates are about 60%, but over a 3-year period, it drops to about 40 or 30%. And so this brings us back to the conversation you and Sid were talking about, which is that bottom of the pyramid. By the time we get to that state, it's not always too late, thankfully, and it's getting, again, possible to cure cancers later on. But we really have to address this earlier, Sid.
There's no doubt about it, but the important feature of this is that, as I said in the past, the three levels of the pyramid. By the way, the middle level is, as I said, early detection. Were dissociated from each other to a large extent. There were people who were working on prevention who thought of the total sum of cancer money or the total sum of resources as a zero-sum game. Every piece of money that goes to treatment is taken away from prevention. That's less and less true because we are being informed by what is the biology is informing us in every direction. I mean, as I said, we now know a lot more about immunotherapy. We hope to learn a lot more about obesity. Obesity is a great example. In fact, I made the provocative idea that we haven't discovered a carcinogen since the 1990s. We actually have,
Sugar.
Although it's not technically a carcinogen in the standard sense. It does not damage DNA as we understand it. But what it does is it might create human states, physiological states, that might be inflammatory, that might be otherwise linked to obesity, that somehow or the other clearly increase the risk of certain cancers, but not other cancers. So
and you're talking about sugar, right?
Sugar is one of them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sugar is one of them. I mean, we're running, actually, we ourselves, we wrote a big study on this. It was just published in Nature. We're running a big study on this, starting very soon, changing the diet to make it more receptive to chemotherapy. That's our study. But so what we're finding out is that that if the ecosystem would work correctly, that we should be able to find trapdoors or real insights between these three aspects of the pyramid, and that will move the clock forward because clearly something is, we cannot afford to treat hundreds of millions of patients with extraordinarily expensive drugs, especially if the responses are not durable.
So in a minute, I just want to open it up for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you, hopefully. I think we've got microphones in just a second. But we'll call you in just a second. But I want to follow up on this issue of whether we are doing enough in the science systematically to have an effort in the prevention effort. In other words, are we finding biomarkers that can warn us of a cancer state or cancer progression? You mentioned the fact that we really haven't found any chemical carcinogens of significance that we can identify as, yes, this is causing cancer, even though they may be part of a slew of chemicals that are damaging DNA. How do we change the culture so that we do shift a little bit more towards that bottom pyramid?
Well, I think one of the ways is to have very strict criteria. I mean, I think I liked Mickey's comments about entrepreneurship. But on the other hand, we also, the criteria for judging whether a drug works or a therapy works or a prevention mechanism works are and have been very clearly defined. We can't keep changing the goalposts, and the FDA has been very thoughtful for a long time, and CDC has been very thoughtful for a long time about making clear that if you shift goalposts, things go horribly wrong.
Right.
So there's a process by which any therapy or any experimental modality is evaluated through a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 study. It is the endpoints are created so that we're looking for survival and mortality. Mortality is a very important endpoint because there are endemic biases in response rates and survival rates and so forth. We can talk about them. They're extensively studied. So you need to have hard endpoints. You need to follow the rules. And so on one hand, the entrepreneurship is very helpful because it breaks and disrupts the ecosystem. But on the other hand, there's also pushback, important pushback from organizations that know that by changing goalposts and making language slippery, it actually doesn't help. So
interesting.
So there has to be a push-pull dynamic here, and that's very important.
Fantastic. We've got a question from Seth Berkley, CEO of Gavi.
Thanks, Clifton. And I love your Sid Soil kind of way of thinking about this. I want to build on what you just talked about, and it's interesting. I mean, I would argue exercise is an example of something that improves health in multiple ways, probably prevents cancer. So there's an example of something that can be recommended. But what we've also done in the past is we've had these crazes. We all remember Linus Pauling with vitamin C, and then it was selenium, and it was vitamin E, and vitamin D, and one of the challenges, I think, when you do that, it's the right idea. You know, how do you build the immune system up by giving it nutrition? But the problem is that when you put that intervention in, you change all the loops, and you downregulate things and upregulate things. How do we get to an understanding of those interventions? And one of the problems with those is very hard. If you have hundreds of millions of dollars to be made for drugs, you have an incentive, but what's the incentive to do those simple manipulations, do the large-scale trials that are necessary to get us, you know, simple things we can use globally on the prevention side?
Yeah, it's a great question.
I think one stab at it is really, I mean, you should, you know, take the first stab at that since you have been involved in a more global sense.
You know, it's not an easy answer, obviously, or we would have already figured it out. But as we begin to look at things like single-cell genomics, we can tease out the relationship between a perturbation here and the downstream or upstream effects of that. It's going to take a lot of time, but as I said at the beginning, we have the tools now to begin to probe these things. And I think, as you were saying earlier, the discipline and the science that needs to go into being really clear about the endpoints that we're looking for, it's systems biology. And so whether you're talking about an inexpensive intervention or a complex intervention, we still have to go through the same processes.
We don't have incentives.
Well, so the simple interventions, I wouldn't say simple, so it's interventions that are not pharmaceutical in their fundamental nature, such as diet,
exercise.
Right. Diet, reduction of obesity, etc. These fall very much within the category of national institutes. So the NIH, for instance, is now funding large epidemiological studies and large dietary studies. We actually were part of them. And these are really important epidemiological studies. So you begin by, first of all, being disciplined, not moving goalposts, and number two, relying on federal institutions, such as the NIH, such as European institutions, to fund studies where the incentives are not pharmaceutical. And you have to empower them to be able to do that. You have to empower them with money, you have to empower the scientists who do them, the epidemiologists, and you have to give them arm them with the right language to do that. And then, simultaneously, you allow the pharmaceutical universe, starting with academic laboratories who work on this, including my own, to move along drugs that will treat, prevent, and potentially cure cancer.
It's interesting, Seth, who represents Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, it reminded me, we do have some preventive approaches to cancer. One is the HPV vaccine. Another one is the cervical cancer vaccine, which has not been as widely endorsed as it should be. And there are others that, just from a vaccination standpoint, we could be reducing a tremendous amount. Julie, do you?
Well, and we are. And in fact, one of the dimensions of this that's rarely discussed really is the success in drastically reducing the incidence of hepatitis B-related liver cancers.
Liver cancers, yeah.
Many years ago, Merck tech transferred our entire intellectual property for hepatitis B vaccine to China, and you can watch the incidence of liver cancer in China go down over the past several decades. So that's a cancer prevention vaccine. And we're seeing the same thing with HPV vaccine. The early data from Australia now just showing that not only are you preventing genital warts, but you're preventing the early stages of HPV-related cancer. So,
and as Sid was showing, it's also another dimension of the immunotherapy.
But in fairness, these are cancers where the infectious disease etiology is known.
Right.
I have a theory that there are other cancers that are probably infectious, and we haven't discovered that yet. So hopefully we'll have more vaccines down the road. But again, it's a technology that is improving, and we will be able to take some cancers off the table.
That's exciting. We have another question right in front of Seth. Oh, there's this lady right here. Yes. Could you identify yourself too?
I'm Caroline from Belgium.
Okay.
On the level of prevention, I have a question. How much more do we know about cancer being in our genes, being genetic? Like we know a few genetic cancers, breast, and we know a few known genes about that. Is there more
Cancer
research?
is fundamentally a genetic disease. There's no way around that idea. Fundamentally, cancer is caused by mutations that disrupt mainly growth, sometimes death, and things that feed into growth and death, including metabolism and the way cells differentiate and live and survive. So there's no getting around the fact that fundamentally speaking, cancer is a genetic disease and will always be a genetic disease. Now, the question is, there are about 4 or 5 ways that DNA damage can occur, thereby unleashing mutations. Number one is that you can inherit them. You can inherit the damaged gene from your parents. So a classic example of that would be BRCA1 and BRCA2. So you can inherit that. We now know that the inheritance can be quite complex, and we're making dramatic advances in teasing apart the complexity of that inheritance. By this, I mean the following. If you take all the patients who have inherited breast cancer as a circle and ask the question, how many of them can be explained by single gene mutations that they inherited from their parents? It turns out only 30%. 70% of the patients who have inherited breast cancer running in their family, mom had it, grandma had it, et cetera, 70% we could not explain before because their risk was carried not by one gene, but by hundreds and possibly thousands, possibly tens of thousands of genes interacting with each other. We are now using computational algorithms being able to predict that risk. Those women will hopefully be screened using various techniques, mammography being only one of them, and hopefully we'll be able to prevent cancer in those. So that's one, is that you inherit it from your parents. Number two, you can get it because viruses go and tamper with your DNA. There are many examples of this, cancer-causing viruses. That might occur because viruses directly tamper with your DNA, or they create inflammatory milieus that cause cells to divide and therefore make changes in their DNA. Number three is that it can be caused by carcinogens. So chemicals, including radiation, which go and damage DNA in its chemical form and thereby contribute to the alteration of DNA. And number four, and that's the worst one, accident. So when cells divide, like all copying machines, they can make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, you can get mutations. So really speaking, there are 4, and you can say maybe a 5th, inflammation, 4 or 5 mechanisms by which cancer occurs. And different cancers use different intersections of these 4 or 5 mechanisms to occur. But fundamentally speaking, cancer is and always will be a genetic disease.
So it's interesting because, if you're talking about all the accidents that have to accumulate to create a truly malignant phenotype, one that's capable of proliferating and metastasizing, it's a 1,000,000,000 to 1 shot. But in a body with 1 trillion cells, 1,000,000,000 to 1 shot doesn't seem so small after all, right? We've got a question over there. Yeah. You identify yourself, please.
Yes. I'm Makoto Suematsu from Tokyo, the president of the Japan Agency for Medical Research and Development. And my question is, I'm always dreaming of a global data sharing. And particularly in Japan, that we are analyzing the genetics of the super centenarians and the semi-super centenarians and the young centenarians. They are all over 100 years old. And they are expert to escape from any kind of stress and carcinogen perhaps. And, but if we can shake hands with each other and collect these genetics data and compared with those who suffered from cancer, so can you imagine if we can get some nice idea which never happened before and making a new approach? That is my question.
It's a great question. And we've got a researcher on the academic side and one on the drug side. How do we improve our sharing capability?
Well, that's a tough question. I am part of the National Academy of Medicine in the United States, which is undertaking an effort to try to improve the processes for data harmonization and sharing. And on the most advanced level, that's brilliant idea, and we definitely need to do it. But when you start getting down into the complexities of the governance and the interoperability and the ownership and the privacy issues, it very quickly becomes complex. And I think the opportunity in that space is for middleware, where we need private-public partnerships, in some cases, research institutes such as the one you're describing, or academic consortium, where there are a number of data sharing agreements going on now across networks of academicians, and pediatrics in particular comes to mind, where we're working out agreements for being able to do that. But I think the dream of uniform data sharing is a long way off at this point in time.
Although I have to say that the success of data banking for cancer genomics has been extraordinary. The UK Biobank, for instance, achieved something that, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say that because of a variety of reasons, the United States actually fell behind in appropriate biobanking. So the UK Biobank is a very simple idea. It takes the genomes, anonymized genomes of individuals, and attaches to them a whole bunch of biometric data, including how long they live, whether they get breast cancer, whether they get Alzheimer's disease. And already we're finding from that UK Biobank extraordinarily important information. This goes back to your question. Remember I said that 70% of those people who have familial breast cancer, whom we couldn't before detect based on genetics because the genetics was complicated. In fact, from the UK Biobank data now, we can find women who have a 9 to 10-fold increase in breast cancer risk based on tens of thousands, actually, I would say thousands of gene variations that increase their risk. I'll make one more point about this, which is that in the UK, it required a change of culture. It required a change of culture where people said that, yes, there is a privacy risk, there is a possible risk, but we will anonymize it very deeply, and we will only allow people who have signed lots of agreements, etc., are appropriately trained to have access to the biobank information, so that it just doesn't become a kind of free-for-all. In the centenarian database, what's emerging is very interesting. If among the centenarians, among the supercentenarians, in fact, although it's a small group, people who live to 120, 118, 116, whatever, they don't seem to die of cancer. They die of degenerative diseases. Their bones break. They die of osteoarthritis and its complications. They die of neurological diseases that are degenerative. So there's a lot of information in all of these biobanks, and even though we might not be able to share it globally, I think the UK Biobank has shown us very clearly that if you do put information into a biobank and guard it safely and anonymize it, you can get a lot of important information in terms of exposure, genetics, and risk. Yeah,
that was a great question, and UK Biobank is great. We've got a question right here. Let us know who you are, please.
So I'm Mamta. I come from India. I have had familial breast cancer. I've been through breast cancer 3 times in my life. I've lost my sister to breast cancer. My question here is, every time that I have gotten breast cancer, it's a new primary. It's never been a metastatic disease. That one phenomenon I really can't understand, that how can someone get 3 new primaries?
Precisely because of the genetic risk of cancer, which is being carried, so I'm sorry, in your case, as a hereditary risk. So, I mean, again, I'm ignoring the soil component to this because we don't understand it. So there must be some soil component to this as well. But as far as the seed component to this is the actual development of the breast cancer is concerned, that is because there is clearly a hereditary risk, and that hereditary risk exists in every cell in your body. Every breast cell in your body, every breast epithelial cell in your body carries that hereditary risk, and it's a stochastic phenomenon, a statistical process in which one of them is acquiring enough mutations to become a cancer cell. I'm ignoring the soil aspect of this.
Sure.
So the first 2 times my ER/PR was negative.
Yes.
And the 3rd time was strongly positive.
Yes.
So that also I was...
Well, but this is the kind of information that we're getting from complex genomic banks. So I don't know if, you know, I don't want to talk about individual incidents, but what I do want to say is that in the past, a person like you, if they were BRCA1 and BRCA2 negative and negative for PL, you know, these other genes, 4, 5, 6, 7 genes, we would not be able to know whether you actually carried risk or didn't carry risk. We wouldn't know whether to screen you or not screen you, etc. Now we do know. We are beginning to know, we can identify with if the genomes of this audience was sequenced for breast cancer alone, for familial breast cancer alone, there would be 1 or 2 people who we would be able to identify and say that you have a 9 to 10-fold higher risk than the general population of having breast cancer. This is a small study. We have to generalize it across population. It's a European study. It's a white study. It's a white female study. There are many ifs, ands, or buts, but there is definite progress on identifying women with breast cancer with higher risk.
Thank you.
And my last question is that if I ever were to get cancer again, would immunotherapy help me? I mean, you don't know my entire history, but yet, I mean, it's a very random question.
We can't unfortunately dispense medical advice from the stage here. What we've learned in this last hour, obviously, that cancer is extremely personal, that it affects people. Forget the statistics, as we've learned from Mickey and his dad and from you. It couldn't be more personal. We've also learned how extraordinarily complex it is, and if you had to find 3 people to help solve that complexity, you couldn't do better with Hiroshi Mikitani, Julie Louise Gerberding, and Sid Mukherjee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.